All right, everyone. So we're going to continue with the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. But before we talk about that, we're going to discuss the Reconstruction again, just a revision. So the Reconstruction started from the end of the Civil War, and it ended in 1877 with the Compromise of 1877. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 freed some of the slaves, but not all of them. And the question after the Civil War was how to reintegrate the South. And basically the South was under military occupation, and an oath of loyalty was demanded from the Southerners. This resulted in a conflict between the President and Congress. The President, who was Andrew Johnson after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and he wanted a less harsh Reconstruction, whereas the Congress wanted to punish the South. Three important amendments were adopted during this time. The 13th was about the abolition of slavery. The 14th gave citizenship to the former slaves, and it was also used later. It's even used today because it very much involves it protects the rights of the citizens from the states, because the Constitution originally was mostly about the protection from the federal government, whereas this included protection from the state governments. And the 15th ensured that the right to vote has to be given to the former slaves. But during the Reconstruction, we can also witness the dominance of the northern economy over the South, which was, pretty much not according to the liking of the Southerners. There was also, as a consequence, large-scale resistance to the Reconstruction. The most famous one that you might have heard about was the Ku Klux Klan, or also known as the KKK, which still exists, although it is, not nearly as strong and not nearly as important as it was in the past. It's a white supremacist and racist organization that committed acts of terror, acts of violence against black people, against Catholics, against Jews, against immigrants, so everybody who was not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Also in the South, segregation was introduced. They called these the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was the derogatory nickname that was used for black people in the South, as these segregation laws basically separated the whites and the blacks from each other in public spaces, and they were in effect until the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Du Plessis versus Ferguson, a Supreme Court decision, even strengthened the Jim Crow laws, because it said that it is okay to be separate as long as it is equal. This was in relation to train cars, so it was okay to have separate train cars for whites and for blacks as long as the service is equal. And as you'll see, this was later revised by a later Supreme Court in the 1950s. Many methods were used to deny the right to vote to black people. For example, literacy tests were introduced. What this meant was that they supposedly saw or checked whether somebody can read and write, but in reality this was just used to take away the right to vote from blacks. Also, grandfather clauses were introduced, which meant that those people whose grandfather could also vote were allowed to vote. And of course, the grandfathers of the slaves, the freed slaves, were slaves, so they were not allowed to vote. The Supreme Court eventually deemed this unconstitutional in 1915. The Reconstruction was also characterized by widespread corruption. And its end was also corrupt. the Compromise of 1877. At the election of 1876, the Democrats and the Republicans were in a deadlock. So basically, the solution was that the Democrats allowed the Republicans to retain the presidency in return for ending the Reconstruction. So all the states, all the southern states were admitted back into the Union, even though they didn't take an oath and they still had discrimination. And the Reconstruction was not completed, and blacks remained disenfranchised in the South. So they could not really participate in politics. They were economically oppressed very often. They unfortunately had to go back to the same people who used to own them as slaves, now as freemen, and back for them to be let back, because often these black people were just, got freedom, but they didn't have any skills, they didn't own any property, so they were forced to go back to their former slave owners. So the Gilded Age. When we talk about the Gilded Age, we mean the period from the end of the Reconstruction, so the 1870s, up until about 1900. The name gilded means that it is covered in gold, so it looks golden from the outside, but inside it is not as good as it looks. The name comes from Mark Twain, who was one of the big writers of this period. This is the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, which is something that, unlike in the First Industrial Revolution, the US played a great part. So the US became a mainly rural and a mainly agricultural country to an urban and industrial society. What do I mean by this? That agriculture used to be the main branch of the economy in the United States, and that most people used to live in the rural parts of the country, but by the end of this time, this changed, and most people lived in cities, and industry was the main branch of the economy. The US became the strongest industrial power in the world, and millions of immigrants came, mostly from Europe, through the new immigration. This brought about major social changes and many crises and many contrasts between the rich and the poor. So the US was becoming more wealthy. People were earning more and more, and people were becoming richer, but there was a growing social gap between the billionaires, who were the capitalists, and the working class that newly appeared. First, let us discuss the Second Industrial Revolution. So, during the Second Industrial Revolution, the pulling factor of the economy was the railroad. What do I mean by this? This means that the railroad pulled other industries with it as well. So, in order to be a railroad, you need coal, so coal mining started, then steel production. The railroad was a very big enterprise in the United States. You had to build rails all across the whole country, bridges, tunnels, and so on. And these people who were building the railroad needed to eat, they needed a place to sleep, they needed entertainment, so it basically brought about a booming of many sectors. And at the end, even oil became important. Cars also appeared at the end, but this was already the third phase of the Industrial Revolution, where the cars are the pulling factor. So the transition was from agriculture to industry. Whereas most Americans were working in the agriculture before the Civil War, even though there was some industry in the north, by the end of this period, industry was the #1 employer. There were also many inventions at the time. I'm pretty sure you can name at least a few. For example, light bulb, the telegraph, or the telephone, the radio. A lot of the things that we use today were created at this time, like public lighting, and so on. And also the economic structure was different. So monopolization started, which meant that a small number of industries, like companies, were dominating whole industries. They called these big monopolies trusts that were basically solely responsible for almost the whole industry. And towards the end of the period, in order to break these big trusts, these big monopolies up, the Sherman Antitrust Act was created. But it was not employed basically up until the 20th century in any serious attempt. Because if you think about it, monopolies are bad for capitalism. Competition is the most important thing in capitalism. The companies are competing, and if you create a better product or if you create it for cheap, then people are going to be buying your stuff and you're going to be more successful than your competitors. So the urbanization and industrialization, these two twin forces that characterized the Gilded Age, also had their great impact on society. During this time in the economy, the most important trends were encouraging little or no government intervention. They call this with a French word laissez-faire. The most important people during this time were not the politicians, but the robber barons or captains of industry, who were owning these big trusts, and they had control over whole industries, and they became richer than any person before in human history, and their influence can be felt even today. Some of these people included John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, who was basically the robber baron or captain of industry of the Standard Oil. So why do they call them robber barons and captains of industry? Well, it really depends on how you look at them, right? So for some people, these robber barons were like criminals who became rich by immoral or evil means, who were taking away from society. But others saw them as captains, so like trailblazers, positive figures who created new industries and who were great capitalists. So I've already mentioned John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. It's him. He lived to be almost 100, and Standard Oil today lives as ExxonMobil, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. Another important figure was Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, whose company was called US Steel. Carnegie was actually an immigrant from Scotland, and he also became extremely rich. These people also gave a lot to charity. Carnegie is responsible for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That is one of the biggest peace organizations in the world today. And Rockefeller created, for example, the Rockefeller Center is also responsible for a lot of arts, and also created universities, hospitals, and so on. So Cornelius Vanderbilt was another one of the robber barons. He was very influential in transportation. He owned a lot of steamboats, railroads, and so on. This is how he especially became rich. J.P. Morgan, John P. Morgan, was responsible for mostly banking. So even today, for example, you might know the Morgan & Stanley, the Morgan Chase banks are basically the descendants of his big banking monopolies. So at the same time, there were these extremely rich people, but there was also the working class. The working class people who very often lived in slums were working under very bad conditions, and many urban problems appeared. That was related to people living in very close proximity, unhealthy housing, lots of crime, alcoholism, prostitution, and so on. But we can also see the emergence of organized labor, which are trade unions that were standing up for the interests of the working class people. For example, the Knights of Labor was one of the first unions, and the American Federation Labor, the AFL, that exists even today. This is one of the early Chicago Federation of Labors, and this is the current symbol of the AFL, American Federation of Labor. Also, entertainment and sports appeared because, when people used to live in the countryside, they didn't really have time for entertainment. There was always something to do around the farm, to milk the cows, to do something else. But now people had free time, even though they were working 10, 12 hours sometimes. This was still, the weekends are free. Sports also started to spread because when people were living in the countryside and they did a lot of regular physical exercise, they didn't feel like doing sports, but this changed when they started working in factories, and advertising also appeared because in the farms in the old days people used to produce almost everything that they needed, whereas now they could spend their money on things. So the immigration in this period, the large industrial development required a large number of workers, more workers than were available in the US inside. This brought about the so-called period of new immigration, as compared to the old immigration that took place before the Civil War, when the immigrants mostly came from Western and Northern Europe. During the new immigration, that was from the 1870s to the World War I, the immigrants mostly came from Southern Europe, especially Italy, from Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, and a lot of the people who came were Jewish also, and the Far East, for example, from China. More than 20 million immigrants arrived in this period, among them almost 2 million from the territory of Hungary. But you have to keep in mind that this is a territory of the historical Hungary, so it also includes a lot of people of Slovak, Romanian, German origin who came from our country. Nativism appeared. I think we've talked about this earlier. The nativism was is the sentiment against people who are not native-born Americans, meaning that they're immigrants and they are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So they have different skin, they have different religion, and they have different language. So whereas during the old immigration, most of the people who came were white, and if not Anglo-Saxon, at least they spoke some Germanic language, like Scandinavian languages, or like German. But during this time, the people who came were speaking Slavic languages or Romance languages like Italian, or like Hungarian or even Chinese. Many of them were not Protestants, a lot of them were Catholics, and there were even some who were not white, like the Chinese, or at that time the Italians were not considered to be fully white either. So the restrictions on immigration were also introduced. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act that stopped immigration from China in the 19th century. And also an immigration station was set up in Ellis Island in New York City, where the immigrants were vetted. Some of them were even sent back, but the vast majority were let in until 1924. In 1924, they introduced national quotas, meaning that they set up a number based on the census, the counting of the people, and it's basically based on the ethnic origin of the people, so the national origin of the people. They restricted the immigration from each nation. And only a certain number of people were allowed to come in. If you look at it, you can see that whereas most people arrived from Northern and Western Europe until the turn of the century, after that Southern and Eastern Europe became dominant, and also Asia to a certain extent. But they cut it down at around the 1920s. So they tried to make sure that immigration, especially from these undesirable areas, was cut down. So the quota for countries became that in Western and and the Southern and Eastern Europe became low. For example, from Hungary, even though there were years when more than 100,000 people arrived, the quota became only around 500. Okay, so the social issues. I mean, as I've mentioned, this transition from the rural and agricultural to the urban industrial society was painful. You know, people had to leave their farms, give up their earlier lifestyles, move into the cities, and, you know, like engage in a very different type of work that was in many ways more difficult, but also it was more reliable. So, you know, in a farm, if there is bad crop, people can starve, whereas, you know, in a factory where this is not just that way. New problems appeared. The social gap between the rich and the poor was growing a lot bigger, which is not necessarily a problem, I think, because, you know, if the poor become richer and the rich become richer, it's all right. If the gap becomes bigger between them. This immigration and the population growth was also a problem. You know, certain parts of the country became extremely crowded. Labor relations were also problematic between the workers and the industrialists. There were very often strikes that were broken down, sometimes violently. Also, work safety was, well, had left a lot to be desired. Race relations were also problematic. You know, like this was still a time of Jim Crow and racial discrimination. Slums appeared, there was a lot of crime, and people felt that there was loss of moral values as compared to the rural America. You know, there was a lot more prostitution and violence in the big cities and so on, other problems. The big question was, what role should the government play? So there was a big conflict between what they call the social Darwinists and their counterparts, the reform Darwinists. Darwinism was the leading biological theory at the time, and it's basically, Darwinism says that it is about the survival of the fittest, that the fittest animal, the best species, is going to survive and is going to be successful in evolution. And they said that humanity works in a similar way. They tried to adopt Darwin's ideas to human life. And many people, you know, believe that this is cruel, because they said that the people on the top, the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Carnegies, were successful, and the people at the bottom, well, they were not successful because they were just not good enough. And Reform Darwinism claims that it is the duty of the government to raise up these people to the higher, from poverty, because people are not animals, and that we are responsible for each other. At the same time, there were a lot of benevolent millionaires at the time, like Rockefeller or Carnegie, gave a lot to charity, to good causes, and so on. And their goal was to achieve an orderly reform, to not revolutionarily, not like the communists, not by overturning the whole society, but by gradual and orderly reform to bring about this. So let's look at some of the solutions to these issues and sources of reform. First of all, a group of investigative journalists, who are usually called the muckrakers, are very important. These people looked after the corruption of the robber barons, into the difficulties of the working class people, and so on. They were doing this investigative type of journalism. Also important was the role of Christianity, of the churches, who were trying to look for solutions to these problems, the so-called social gospel. They were heavily involved in charity and other issues like this. Then the agrarians, the farmers, were also organizing. They They were called the Grangers. They were basically like their movement or their organization, because they were some of the worst affected by these social changes. Also, the People's Party emerged, commonly also called as populists. They were standing for the farmers and workers instead of the capitalists, and they were very critical of the excesses of capitalism. They wanted inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is the worsening of money and the rising of prices. Why is this good? Well, this is good when people have a lot of loans, because if the money is worth less, then they have to repay it, like they have to repay less, because, you know, if I don't know, like 1 million forint is worth less than when you have to repay it, then what you repay is also worth less. They supported the nationalization of the railroads, the 8-hour working day, women's suffrage, an income tax that would be especially, you know, like heavier on the rich instead of the poor, so that the rich would pay more taxes. Direct election of senators, because before that the senators were appointed by the states and not elected directly. And free silver, that was basically allowing people to coin money, dollars from silver. And William Jennings Bryan was a Democratic candidate, Democratic Party's candidate, who was also supported by the populists, but he was not successful in the presidential candidacy. So conservation also emerged. This was the beginnings of the environmentalist movement. Yellowstone was the first national park to be established, and John Muir was an important voice in conservation, the first environmentalist really. As far as race is concerned, unfortunately, the situation of black people was very difficult, but in order to help this, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was formed. That was basically an organization, and still is, helping black people. So this period was followed by progressivism. Progressivism is a reform movement with a moralistic overtone in the early 20th century. What does this mean? That they wanted to reform to find the solutions to the problems of the Gilded Age, but moralistic, they also meant that it was good. So they wanted to reform society through the intervention of the government. The test case was Wisconsin. Under Governor La Follette, the state of Wisconsin became what they called the laboratory of democracy. So a lot of the policies that later were adopted all over the county were first used in Wisconsin. They introduced anti-monopoly policies, for example, trust busting, breaking up these large trusts that were like, you know, the Rockefellers and the JP Morgans, to break up their monopolies and to enable competition. So they saw the government as responsible for maintaining the balance in society between the working class and the capitalists. So the three progressive presidents were Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican president. He was president from 1901 until 1909. He was the youngest president, but he was not elected first, because he became president when President McKinley was killed by an anarchist. His nickname was Trust Busting Teddy, because Roosevelt broke up a lot of trusts, a lot of these big monopolies. And his program was called the Square Deal. He saw the government's role as a neutral arbiter, like a neutral referee in industrial debates between workers and capitalists. He was also responsible for the railroad regulation. He adopted the Pure Food and Drug Act. He read the book of Upton Sinclair about the was called The Jungle. It was about meat packing industry in Chicago, which was, of course, kind of, well, you can imagine the terrible conditions that were there at the beginning of the 20th century. And based on this, he adopted these regulations like TR did. But at the same time, he could also cooperate with the robber barons like J.P. Morgan when he had to. For example, in 1907, they managed to solve a banking crisis by cooperating with the big banker Morgan. And also he was important because of conservation. He was a famous outdoorsman, hunter, and an enthusiast of nature, and he established many national parks, and he was also known because he got Nobel Peace Prize. He was followed by William Howard Taft. Taft, you can see in his picture as well, whereas TR was a very like muscular, sporting person, Taft was, well, like a big personality. He was also a Republican, followed Theodore Roosevelt. He was appointed by him, and he continued trust-busting. He later became a Supreme Court judge. Under him, 16th Amendment was adopted about the income tax, 17th about the direct election of senators. So you can see that some of the program points of the Populist Party. But he disagreed with Theodore Roosevelt about conservation and other issues, and this led to the split in the Republican Party at the elections of 1912. So, similarly to the election of Abraham Lincoln, two candidates were there on the Republican side. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to become president again, because back in those days it was still allowed to be president more than 2 times. And Taft also wanted to continue his presidency. As a result, Woodrow Wilson was elected as president, a Democrat, and not one of the Republicans. So Woodrow Wilson, who was elected as president in 1912, was a Democrat, the first Democrat for quite a long time, and his program was called New Freedom. Wilson wanted to continue progressivism. So what did he do? So the Underwood Tariff Act, he put restrictions on trade. Something similar was achieved by the Federal Trade Commission Act, where he established the Federal Trade Commission that would regulate trade within the country. He passed, or like under him, was the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed. That was even stricter than the Sherman Antitrust Act. And he established the Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is an institution that serves as the National Bank of the United States. So it is responsible for the printing of dollars. And so if there was no Federal Reserve, if there was no national bank, what was the dollar before? Well, before that, the dollar was just simply gold. The dollar was based on gold, and even if people used paper money, it was backed by physical gold in the bank. So if you went to a bank and you gave them your money, like the paper money, they were supposed to give you gold for it in return. So this was like the gold-based currency. So he was the US president during World War I, about which we're going to talk next class. And he expanded largely the government's control over the economy and social life. Also under him, the 18th Amendment was passed. That was the prohibition. The prohibition of the selling, consumption, and production of alcohol. And also the 19th Amendment, which was women's suffrage, the right of women to vote, was passed under Wilson. So how can we evaluate progressivism? What we can see is an unprecedented growth in the size of the government and its intervention into the economy. The government started to pose as a neutral arbiter in disputes, like a referee, and welfare, conservation, so environmentalism, and employee protection became the tasks of the government. The progressive amendments were passed 16, 17, 18, 19, direct election of senators, income tax, the prohibition and the women's suffrage, but there were still many issues that had to be solved. For example, racial inequality was still present, segregation, even like under Wilson, because he was supporting segregation in spite of him being a progressive president, and women's suffrage was only accomplished after the war. But progressivism, these government-run reforms, became a model for future reforms that we can even witness today. Okay, all right, guys. So have fun and see you next week.